Now, let's have a look at some of the entitled antics of protesters who are helping to destroy the profitability of businesses that cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement, ICE. Businesses that simply comply with the law. Watch these idiot lefties lining up to buy 17-cent ice scrapers at Home Depot, then returning them and then buying them, which essentially stops anyone else, like real customers, being able to shop at Home Depot.
What are you buying? An ice scraper. Nice. What are you guys buying?
We are buying ice scrapers.
Let's bring in documentary filmmaker and commentator Ami Horowitz. Ami, no shock that those scenes are from California. This would be costing affected businesses a fortune.
Yeah, California, my home state. Oh, I'm so proud. By the way, did I hear that right? The ice scrapers are 17 cents. Well, obviously, it's in California. There is no ice. I looked at my local store. I heard about this. They're $2.99. So, yeah, I would have gotten a line for them also. Just wouldn't have returned them. They're too good a deal. Look, for them, this is a twofer, right? Which means, like, on the one hand, they get to do two things at one time, right? They get to protest the fascism of Trump, right? And the ICE raids, and at the same time also help to take down capitalism. So for them, it was a 2-for-1 deal. You know, the right never does this, right? When we have, obviously, the right has issues with the left, issues with different governments in the city government, state governments. President was on the left just last year. But we didn't do this thing. We didn't disrupt commerce. We didn't disrupt people's lives. We didn't go to people's home. It's not the way the right does business. And by the way, I don't know if you saw that in the clip, but they had 24 white crosses to basically saying that there are 24 people who died in ICE custody since Donald Trump. Well, as you know, Rita, I'm a data guy. I don't just let that go. I go into the numbers. I go into the weeds. I did it with this also because that didn't seem right to me. And yeah, indeed, there were between 20 and 24 deaths. But yeah, not exactly in ICE custody. I'm talking, the people that died were actually mostly in hospitals where the US government was actually trying to treat them for underlying conditions. They died in the hospital. Some of them were suicides. But of course, let's not let the truth get in the way of the narrative of the left, right? And you know, I want to point out another thing, that Home Depot, they're not involved in these ICE raids. They don't coordinate with the U.S. government. They went to great pains to say, we have nothing to do with this. But of course, the left doesn't care about the truth, doesn't care about that. And I'll just add one last thing about this, Rita. Look, as you know, we've talked about illegal immigration for years on the show. And I'm going to take a backseat to no one on how I wanted to stop illegal immigration and get rid of illegals in this country. But it's also a very bad look. Okay, when you run into Home Depot and grabbing people off the parking lot, or trying to get jobs, it's one of the reasons, just from an optics perspective, it's one of the reasons why there's been a degradation in support of Donald Trump with the Latino community, which in no small way put him over the top. So I think also one has to look at the politics of this, and it doesn't look good.
It doesn't, but if you want to have mass deportations, you're going to have to do that. There's no nice way of going about this. There's no way where you're going to be able to deport people who are in the country illegally without scenes that are like that and they're sometimes emotional and hard to witness. But it's what he was elected on. He has a mandate to do it. But, Ami, let's stick with law and order. There's been another shocking, unprovoked, violent attack on public transport with a young woman set alight by someone who looks to be a career criminal. And people are drawing comparisons with this case with the horrific murder of Irina Zarutska, whose brutal stabbing was caught on video. The 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee was killed by someone who should have been behind bars. And that is also the case with this latest attack, where 26-year-old Bethany McGee was set on fire on a Chicago L train, allegedly by Lawrence Reed. Now, this is a man with 72 prior arrests. His name's Reed, and he's now facing terrorism charges. But incredibly, Ami, the judge initially overruled a request from prosecutors to have Reed locked up. I mean, this man should have been behind bars. This attack should have never happened. Thankfully, Bethany has survived the attack, but she has suffered horrific injuries.
Yeah, grievous, terrible injuries that may follow her for the rest of her life, unfortunately. Another example of blue city failures on crime, and I think that we have been facing in New York City and will be facing obviously acutely with Zohran Mamdani. Yeah, 72 times being arrested. Rita, I can't think of something I've ever done 72 times at all in my life. That's a lot of arrests. And by the way, more than that, he broke probation over a dozen times. Just so you understand, when you break probation once, you're supposed to go back to jail immediately, okay? But it goes back, remember that the whole bail discussion we had, that video I shot just a couple weeks ago, we talked about it. It's so fascinating because if you remember in that video, I was asking people, do you think your criminal history should be part of how the judge looks at what your sentencing will be? The answer is obviously yes, right? I mean, what else are you going to go by? But the left refuses to do that. This is an example, of that video coming to life where the judge themselves are saying, I'm not going to take their criminal history into account. It's unbelievable. And by the way, this idea of setting people ablaze on our city's transport systems, this is not an isolated incident at all. In fact,
Yep.
I was looking at it. In the last 12 months, Rita, 5 people in Chicago and New York alone were set on fire in those transit. 5 people, Rita, okay? This is an epidemic, okay? No, you can't. This is unbelievable. And look, this is also, I want to point out, a mental health crisis also. And I think it's an example, I've said for years, that I hate to say it, but we know that a lot of these crimes are committed by people with mental health. I think we need to go back. It was Reagan who actually deinstitutionalized mental health criminals. And I think we have to reinstitutionalize people. I don't think we have a choice. And lastly, I'll talk about Brandon Johnson, the absolute and utter failure of a mayor. His response to this was unbelievable. He was talking about how, first of all, this is an isolated incident. Untrue. Crime is up massively in the Chicago Transit Authority. And I was talking about how he's trying to make Chicago one of the safest big cities in the country. Yeah, total fail. Chicago is 3 times the national homicide average. And by the way, has a higher homicide average than Medellin, Colombia. So sorry, Brandon Johnson, that's just not the case.
He is amongst the worst mayors in America, and that's saying something. Ami, before you go, President Donald Trump signed an executive order earlier today that designates chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organisations. The Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni Islamist organisation founded in Egypt back in 1928, and the White House argues this designation will help the US combat the group's transnational network, which is set to fuel terrorism against US interests and allies in the Middle East. Ami, is there going to be much resistance to this move by Donald Trump? Surely the Democrats aren't going to side with the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah. First of all, I spent over a year researching and interviewing members of the Muslim Brotherhood around the world. I went to Cairo and Istanbul and Beirut, Germany, and I met with dozens of Muslim Brotherhood leaders and lay people around the world. And I can tell you it's one of the most dangerous organizations that exists. So kudos to the president for designating them. I'm asking and pushing this for years as a terrorist organization. As far as your question when it comes to the left, they're going to cry foul this. Of course they are. The Muslim Brotherhood was telling me that they have co-opted the left. Like that was part of their strategy. And they of course adopt the language of the left. They talk about victimhood and colonization, right, and occupation. These are all things that they use. They know that the left kind of is attracted to that, and the left has been, for the most part, supportive. The left makes arguments for them, saying they're not a political organization, they're a religious organization. You can't go after them. You can't attack them. While they are those things, and by the way, so is organizations like Hamas, but their main point of business is terror. Like Hamas, and I mentioned Hamas a couple of times because Hamas is a direct offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. There are almost a dozen terrorist organizations across the world that consider themselves part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Their slogan is jihad is the way, and dying for Allah is the greatest good. That's their slogan. This is not me saying this. This is them saying this about themselves. They're incredibly dangerous. And by the way, they have really spent a lot of time and effort in Europe and the United States. The largest Islamic organizations in the U.S., CARE, the student organizations, are part of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And also, very dangerously, they are really involved in the jails. Most people who convert to Islam in the jails do it under the auspices of the Muslim Brotherhood, and 35 to 40,000 people a year are converting to Islam in our jails. And the latest estimates are that 15% of the total population of jails are actually Muslim, and it's a direct response directly because
fascinating.
The Muslim Brotherhood has been converting them. Yeah,
that is fascinating. Ami Horowitz, thank you so much for those insights.